Following the decision of General Synod in 2016 to approve on first reading changes to the marriage canon, there was a part of our Constitution, our handbook, General Synod, that says in between the first and second reading, decisions such as this that change canons of our diocese or of the General Synod or touch on issues of doctrine have to pass two successive readings at General Synod. Passing first reading, the motion is then referred back to provincial and diocesan synods, where it is to be, and there is only one word attached to that, considered. And there's really no definition of what the word consider means. So it was left up to each one of us in our dioceses to determine what consider was going to be all about. I've come across the spectrum on this. I began by thinking that really the General Synod should tell us exactly what they want by way of consideration. But I think now that what we've done in terms of developing a strategy for ourselves here in the diocese has said to me that we look at our context, our circumstance, and our situation, and we determine what is required to provide full consideration of this topic, and then sending that consideration back to the General Synod as they prepare for their deliberations in 2019. So again, thank you so much for that, and that's what brings us here. So when we began the work, what I did was establish a steering committee to help us understand how we were going to do our consideration here to send to General Synod. And that committee was composed of our 4 General Synod delegates who were present in 2016, and that's Ann Patterson, who's right over there tonight, Haroldine Neal Burchert, John Van Stone. They were the 2 lay delegates. John Van Stone, I saw John come in there, right there. John Van Stone and Deacon Lisa Chisholm Smith, who were our 2 lay delegates. To that committee, I invited Dr. Bill Morrow, who is a professor of Old Testament at Queen's School of Religion, to join us. Canon Barbara Robinson, who some of you may know, recently retired from St. Paul's Church in Brockville and serving in many ways in interim positions currently right now in Gananoque and Rockport. And Mr. Andrew Innes of St. Mary Magdalene's Church in Picton, and Dean Don Davidson. So they formed the steering committee, and we began to put together the process that we wanted to follow, leading to our synod this fall and what we were going to do to fulfill that work of consideration. So to date, we have had a clergy day. We had 50 of the clergy of the diocese came out to Providence Spirituality Center, and we invited Bishop Linda Nichols, who was a member of the Marriage Commission that did the work that led to the document This Holy Estate, which formed the basis of the discussions at General Synod and what's forming the basis of our deliberations in terms of our consideration of the motion that was passed at General Synod at first reading. So I just want to run through. So the Clergy Day was held, and Bishop Linda had been the co-chair of that commission, and we provided, there's a feedback that was received. What we're going to be doing is encouraging feedback from parishes, deaneries, individuals, submissions that will come into the steering committee, and all of that will go to form a body of material that will come to our diocesan synod November 1st to 3rd this year. And what my hope is that following discussions, facilitated discussions we're going to have at our diocesan synod, and the feedback that we get from that, all of that will be compiled together and form part of what's referred to as a memorial resolution. A memorial resolution takes that material, and if it's the will of our diocesan synod, we send it to General Synod and say, this is the considered opinion of the people, parishes, clergy of the Diocese of Ontario. So that's the process that we're working on laying out as we're moving through to our synod in 2018 and to 2019 General Synod. Just tonight, we can flip over to the next screen. As you saw up there, what we're doing tonight is understanding this holy state, and we call it a starting point for parish conversations. If you look on our diocesan website, you will see a toolbox that the steering committee has produced for parishes to enable you to have those local conversations in your parish. How to go about doing that, the material that will help you to have those respectful, informed conversations in the life of your parish. And so tonight, we're under no illusion that we are going to solve all the problems of the world in 2 hours and give you a fulsome explanation, but it's to introduce you to this material so that you can have that starting point to carry on with those conversations. So tonight, in terms of our agenda between now and 7:25, I'm going to take you sort of quickly through kind of a high-level look at this holy estate and the material that is contained within it and how it's ordered. And part of that report, if you've not had opportunity to view it or to read it, part of that report includes a section on the biblical and theological rationale for the change in the marriage canon. And this is where Dr. Morrow will come in, and the bulk of our meeting tonight will be on that conversation and some presentations that he's going to make around the authority of Scripture, the marriage and creation accounts, marriage in the New Testament, Romans 1 and natural law, and the differentiated forms of the Christian marriage covenant. And that'll take us up to an opportunity for any outstanding questions that you have. I have received a couple of questions so far from people who like to talk either about the biblical theological rationale or also about process questions that you might have as we're moving forward. So that's sort of the agenda that will carry us through the evening. I'll just change to go to the next slide. One of the things that you'll find in the toolkit and also will govern our conversation tonight is a series of what we refer to as Diocese of Ontario norms for the conversation. As Father Haynes pointed out as he welcomed you tonight, this is a conversation that leads us sometimes into difficult conversations. Sometimes those conversations can be fraught. So we need to try to find a place where we can all stand together and have a respectful, engaged conversation. One of the things that has impressed me immensely up to this point is that in our clergy day and in our two other regional conversations, we've had good, engaged dialogue around the material that is presented. And I'm so pleased at how these norms have been taken to heart. And just to go through them quickly, we will grant that as people of faith, we are all sincere in our beliefs, including our reverence for Holy Scripture. We will know that there might be lesbian and gay persons present, and what I should have put in that, and I didn't, was LGBTQ persons present, a more inclusive sense of understanding that. We will value inclusion and strive for greater understanding of each other. When we speak in the first person. And we will not use language known to be offensive to others. We will respect the right of people to speak of their own experiences. We will respect the privacy of others. And we will ask no questions that we are not prepared to answer ourselves. Now on that section number 7, the importance of privacy, you'll notice tonight that Mark Hauser is here and he is recording. What he will be recording tonight is my presentation and the presentations that Dr. Morrow will be giving, because we want to put those presentations up on the website for people who couldn't be here and who want to engage in this conversation across our diocese. Anything that you say, engagement that you have in the conversations, those are not being recorded. We're just putting these things up so that others can have an opportunity to hear the material being presented. Can go to the next slide, Haynes, please. There's a document that I would like to encourage you to have a look at, because as we begin tonight, one of the questions I get is, how long have we been discussing this issue in the life of the church? And it's a conversation that stretches back a long way. The Diocese of Toronto did a fine job in putting together this document, which if you go on the Diocese of Toronto website, on their resource section around the changes to Canon 21 and the marriage canon, you can find this document, a brief survey of the conversations. And why I like it is that it starts and moves through from the very beginning of the conversations and gives nice objective précis of the different documents that have been produced since this conversation first began.
It basically starts, to sort of answer that question when it all began. You recall the act of Parliament in Canada to decriminalize homosexual acts between consenting adults was passed in 1967. And very shortly after that, the Church began a conversation around issues related to human sexuality, to begin to study the issue, to understand it, to bring that conversation and dialogue within the Church. And the first of those documents, a Human Sexuality Task Force report to the Anglican Church, was in 1976. And so it goes through a timeline. Now, it's from a Diocese of Toronto perspective, so there's various events that happened in the life of that diocese that they make reference to here. But I think that's also very valuable. For example, you might remember the Jim Ferry case that came before the diocesan court in the Diocese of Toronto when Jim Ferry was removed from his position for being in a partnered same-sex relationship. And so that's discussed in this document as well. But all of the particular events help you to kind of relate to where that conversation has been over the course of the last 50 years. So I would commend that document to your attention. But what I want to start with tonight, of the many places where we could start, is to go back to General Synod in 2013. So we can go to, thank you. Go back to General Synod 2013 and the resolution that came on the floor of General Synod that very, very quickly moved the conversation that we were having in the Church. If you will recall, the conversations before that within the Anglican Church of Canada were all focused around the issue of what was referred to as the blessing of same-sex unions. And you'll recall the decisions of various synods, first of them being the Synod of the Diocese of New Westminster, which passed a resolution asking the bishop to authorize a liturgy for the blessing of same-sex unions. That had been the conversation point in the Anglican Church up until 2013. This resolution changed the conversation rapidly and dramatically to begin to talk about the issue of marriage. And the resolution was worded as you see here: direct the Council of General Synod to prepare and present a motion at General Synod 2016 to change Canon 21 on marriage to allow the marriage of same-sex couples in the same way as opposite-sex couples, and that this motion should include a conscience clause so that no member of the clergy, bishop, congregation, or diocese should be constrained to participate in or authorize such marriages against the dictates of their conscience. That was the original motion. You can go to the next slide, Haynes. Between the day the motion was presented and the following day, there were two individuals who got together to propose an amendment to this resolution C003. I was present at that General Synod in 2013, and when those proposed amendments were put on the floor, the individuals, the presence of those two individuals was powerful for the General Synod, because it was Dean Peter Elliott of the Diocese of New Westminster and Bishop Stephen Andrews of the Diocese of Algoma. That visual of two individuals who were probably as far polar opposite on this issue as there can be, working together to try to find a way to move the conversation forward, had a huge impact on that synod. I know where I was sitting and the folks around me, one of the comments was, if Peter Elliott and Stephen Andrews can agree on something, that's good enough for me. And it was a huge issue. And so the amendments that were incorporated into the motion and that were passed were as follows. The motion will also include supporting documentation that demonstrates broad consultation in its preparation, explains how this motion does not contravene the solemn declaration, and many of you know the solemn declaration which established our General Synod in the late 19th century, and you can find that in the front section of our Book of Common Prayer. And basically it speaks about that it creates the independence of the Anglican Church of Canada, but speaks very clearly to how any changes that we make in polity and in doctrine has to be in essential harmony with that received by the Church of England. So that was a significant part of the resolution at General Synod 2013. And then, next slide, Haynes confirms immunity under civil law and the Human Rights Code for those bishops, dioceses, and priests who refuse to participate in or authorize the marriage of same-sex couples on the basis of conscience. It's an interesting word, that word immunity. It's a complicated word. It's more of a legal word that relates to, if you've committed a criminal act and you want to confess to that, and they will give you immunity from prosecution. This really is, there's other language maybe that might be better, but that's just a former lawyer muttering about language, so don't worry about that. But you understand what it means. And then Section D provides a biblical and theological rationale for this change in teaching on the nature of Christian marriage. So that was the resolution that was ultimately passed, and then the process was put together, which ultimately resulted in the production of the document called This Holy Estate, a marriage commission established, and they began to fulfill the requirements of that General Synod resolution. So I just want to take a little bit of time to go over kind of a high-level view of that report. So we just start dedicated to Canon Robert Falby, who was the original chair, was the Chancellor of the Diocese of Toronto, and tragically and sadly passed away during the time of its production. So the report is dedicated to him. Begins with an introduction, background, terms of reference. It deals with the issue of consultation, the solemn declaration, then Section 4, the conscience clause, the biblical and theological rationale, and then its conclusion and appendices. So just starting with that, we'll just flip right through to get to Section 1. Okay, go to the next slide. So the background in terms of reference, the Commission will consider and prepare documentation about the following matters, specifically in General Synod Resolution C003, and then it reiterates those aspects that I just went over at the end of the resolution that was presented to General Synod. And going to the next slide, and this report will also include a recommended wording of the enabling motion called for in General Synod Resolution C003. One of the things that I think is important to note is that the resolution called on the General Synod in 2016 to have presented to it a motion in the affirmative. So the Commission had a very specific mandate that it had to find the biblical and theological rationale and then present the motion that would be framed in the affirmative. And it's important to note because they had to work within those particular constraints and also prepare a recommended wording for a conscience clause that would come before General Synod 2016. So going to the consultation part, just a brief overview of what was done under that requirement. Broad consultation was demonstrated through submissions from Anglican Church of Canada members. There were 223 submissions that came in from 26 dioceses across the country. And all of those submissions had to be signed and attributable, and they're also available for you to read on the National Church website. Consultation with ecumenical partners, including the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, who are our full communion partners, the United Church of Canada, and the Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue in Canada. And I had the privilege of being part of two of those consultations as the Anglican Church of Canada's rep to the United Church Dialogue and to the Anglican Roman Catholic Bishops Dialogue. We also have an Anglican Roman Catholic Theological Dialogue that has been going on for a number of years, and they also provided a very fulsome submission to the work that was being done. Globally, within the Anglican Communion, there was consultation with the Anglican Communion through the Inter-Anglican Standing Commission on Unity, Faith, and Order, and they also provided a recommendation to our General Synod that's available for you to look at. And there was also consultation with our Anglican Indigenous bishops around this particular issue. The Solemn Declaration, Section 3. The Declaration of Principles, the General Synod has jurisdiction, and as I said to you earlier, in the definition of the doctrines of the Church, in harmony with this solemn declaration adopted by this Synod. So the question is, what constitutes harmony in the solemn declaration? To hold the doctrine, sacraments, and discipline of Christ as the Church of England has received and set forth in the Book of Common Prayer. You will notice that how do we define harmony? It's basically defined by the members of General Synod as they gather together, as they make a decision to determine whether something they're doing is in harmony. I can give you a couple of instances where there were some pretty significant changes in the life of our church, which were not at the time also available within the Church of England. Things such as the remarriage of divorced persons, a decision that we took, also the ordination of women, which was done before the Church of England. So we had to make that determination as to how those changes in the polity and practice of our church were in harmony as defined by the solemn declaration. The conscience clause was produced, and there was a legal opinion sought about that conscience clause, because this is an issue that engenders a lot of conversation even today around the issue of conscience for those who cannot acquiesce if the church decides to move forward to expand the definition of marriage. The legal opinion basically stated that there is significant risk that the proposed resolution will be subject to a challenge. And the way I like to refer to that is, anybody can be sued. I mean, I can be sued today. You can be sued tomorrow. Whether or not the suit is successful or has grounds upon which to be successful is an entirely different matter. And the legal opinion that was obtained stated that, however, the church will have strong defense against such challenges, and in our view, it is highly unlikely that these challenges would be successful in the light of the prevailing jurisprudence and the very clear statements by the Supreme Court of Canada in the same-sex reference. The Government of Canada had a reference produced by the Supreme Court of Canada on precisely this issue, and I added in here exactly what the Supreme Court said. Nothing in the Act affects and this is the Civil Marriage Act that we're talking about here. When the federal government, and you have to know that in our Constitution, the federal government has the authority to determine who can be married. So the parties to the marriage, the provincial government is responsible for the administration of the bureaucracy around that. So that's how our system works. But the federal government was determining if they would be subject to a legal challenge related to those issues of conscience. Nothing in the Act affects the freedom of officials of religious groups to refuse to perform marriages that are not in accordance with their religious beliefs. So the issue is, perhaps, it would be the same sort of question if a member of the Roman Catholic Church decided to sue the Roman Catholic Church because they were divorced, a faithful Roman Catholic, and wanted to be married, claiming there was a discrimination. Again, a suit that certainly would not stand up to that kind of rigorous examination, according to that Supreme Court of Canada decision. But it's an issue that I think we have to bear in mind. There are cases when we were in Brockville. One of the cases that was raised up was a case you may or may not. I had not heard of it. So while Bill was doing his presentation, I got on my iPhone and looked it up. It's of course the Wilson colony, a Hutterite colony out west. That it was contrary to their religious beliefs to have their licenses, their driver's license, to have their photographs taken. And they objected to the requirement of the government to have themselves photographed for the driver's licenses. The government claimed they had to do this because of the rise in the issue of identity theft, and this became the issue whereby they felt it was appropriate for them to infringe on that religious freedom. So if you know our Constitution, Section 2 sets out those conscience provisions under religious freedom. Section 1 of our Constitution states that those freedoms can be abrogated only by those principles that can be justified in a free and democratic society. And so that was the issue that the government went under, and the Supreme Court of Canada in a 6-3 ruling stated that yes, it was an infringement of their religious freedom, but Section 1 allowed the government to do that because that particular issue rose past that bar. Now, driver's licenses and photographs and same-sex marriage, it's probably hard to get them in the same room together, but the issue is that the legal opinion that we received is that because the other thing is when you are acting in a way that you can stand upon, and I mentioned this to the clergy when we met, there is generations of long-held, and Archbishop Colin Johnson wrote a letter to his clergy on that issue. There are generations of our doctrine and practice upon which people, members of the clergy, who feel by matters of conscience that they can't do this, can hang their hat on that. It's not as if there's absolutely nothing that they can stand upon around that. It would be, for example, and the example I use, is if a clergy said to somebody, and also in Canon 21, there has always been a conscience clause. Nothing constrains any of us to ever marry anybody. And I thankfully have only had to use that once during my ministry as a priest, but you have that right to do that. Pastorally, you have to sit down with the individuals and explain to them why you're taking the decision that you're taking. And but this question needs to be grappled with around if the marriage canon is extended to include same-sex marriage around this. But I think you can stand on that issue, as opposed to if somebody said, I don't believe in interracial marriage, and therefore I will not marry you because of that. Will you be sued? Yes, you will. Will the church stand with you in that lawsuit? No, it will not. If a suit happens, and as I said to the clergy, and I would repeat, and I've repeated at each one of the consultations, repeat here tonight, that if somebody is standing on the matter of conscience, on issues that can be justified and demonstrated within the polity and practice of our church as we have received it, that the church has a duty to stand with you in that. And I would make that commitment to anyone here. I think we need to be very clear about that. But like I say, we could spend a whole afternoon, evening session on talking about conscience clause, but it is an issue that has been raised a number of times, so that's why I wanted to pause on it for a bit. The biblical and theological rationale that I'll turn over to my colleague Bill here in a moment, and he will go through that, but just basically say the Commission will consider and prepare documentation for this change, as it was noted in the resolution. And then the appendices of the document give you a variety of things, including the text of the solemn declaration, the draft motion that the Commission was asked to prepare, and then a whole series of additional materials, a Q&A related to it, and also some study questions. Our group, and you'll see in that toolbox that we created for the parishes, our steering committee took that series of questions that is in this Holy Estate and kind of made them post-2016. So there's something that you could do following that decision on first reading. And the important thing to note about using that study guide is that it's intended to relate to each one of the sections in the document, This Holy Estate. But that also provides you with some material to work with in having parish congregational conversations. I'm very pleased that there have been a number of these conversations that have happened already. I've had a variety of emails from folks across the diocese letting me know about these conversations, and what I want to say is that when those conversations happen, if you want to produce some material coming out of that, if there's a statement that you want to make or a majority, minority opinion, however you want to organize that, do that up and send it in so that we can include it in that material. It needs to be attributable. So to sort of say that, members of the parish of X got together, there were 10 of us, and we would like to make the following submission. And so that we can have all of that and put that together to go in our memorial resolution. Then just a note there on the website reference, if you go on the National Church website, you can find This Holy Estate. I just want to take 1 sec. I promised Bill I wouldn't cut into his time too badly. He sent me a very subtle email today, which led me to cut down my presentation dramatically. You may not be aware of that.
I'm aware of it.
Yeah, I know. But I do want to just take a few seconds so you can take a look at the resolution that was passed at General Synod, because there was significant change that happened at General Synod 2016 related to the resolution. As you recall, there was, again, and we've been talking for quite a while about the conscience clause issue, so you'll see some change there as well. So the resolution that was passed, and that R2 means the second revision, so an amended resolution that came before General Synod, was to declare that Canon 21 on marriage in the Church applies to all persons who are duly qualified by civil law to enter into marriage, and to make the following consequential amendments to Canon 21. So basically, if you look at Canon 21 as it is currently written, and it's important to note that Canon 21 remains, as of this day, the law of the Church as it is written now, because remember, the changes need to pass 2 successive sessions of General Synod. So if you look at that, you'll see where the changes will come in if it passes second reading. It will change the phrase "a man and a woman" to "the parties to the marriage," and the regulations will substitute "the partners" for the phrase "husband and wife." And I think it's important to note that the result of that, don't make the mistake that it limits marriage. What they're doing is expanding the definition. So it's an expansion, and the language in the canon is intended to allow for that expansion. Add the following to section 11 of the regulations. So this is where the change was made from the original resolution. A minister may only solemnize a marriage between persons of the same sex if authorized by the diocesan bishop. What the effect of that amendment did was, and you'll see at that point was where there was the conscience clause was put in, and it also had created a scenario where dioceses that were in favor of the change didn't have to do any more work. The change was made and they could continue. Dioceses that were not in favor of the change had to do additional work to opt out of the canon. And I remember the discussion at General Synod that this was patently unfair, onus to place on people that were, it should be the people who were in favor that had the work to do to continue on to take advantage of the expanded definition. So through adding that in, it comes down to the diocesan bishop who has to extend permission. So the permission would have to be extended if the synod of the diocese passed a resolution asking the bishop to extend the permission. The permission would be extended if, after a synod asked for that extension, a parish asked for that extension. Permission would be extended if an individual clergy came and said, "I want that permission extended to me." So it shifts the onus on who has to do the work moving forward from the change at General Synod. But this is also subject of much debate, so I'm just kind of laying that out just so you have an awareness that it was a fairly significant change at General Synod 2016 that focuses on the diocesan bishop. And as you know, some dioceses after General Synod 2016 made the decision in what they refer to as an interim pastoral accommodation, I think is the way it's phrased, to permit marriages in a limited number of parishes within their dioceses. So this is done in Toronto, it's done in Ottawa. The decision that I took was that we needed to do a lot of work before we came to those kinds of decisions, and this is why we're doing this work leading up to our diocesan synod. If this passes General Synod in 2019 and it's passed in the affirmative in second reading, it doesn't come into effect until January the 1st of the following year. And then, so in our synod coming up in 2018, that's why I've said to those who, because we had those of you who are synod delegates will remember that we had a resolution came to our synod get my dates straight, I think our synod in 2016. A resolution came to our diocesan synod, which I had ruled the initial resolution, legal term is ultra vires. It was beyond our competence as a synod to make a decision to treat a decision of General Synod as if it were the law of the land. And I said, we have a process that we follow. There's very good reason for that. and we have to adhere to the process that's moving forward. I did say to the folks that wanted to bring a subsequent resolution at our diocesan synod, they wanted to bring a take note, what I referred to as a take note resolution, where they wanted me to take note of the will of the diocese. But as it had passed the deadline, it required a 2/3 vote, and it fell short of the 2/3 to get on the floor of our synod. The same is true of our synod in 2018. This is, and we can debate why I've decided this, but I feel in terms of my leadership as your bishop, I felt that we needed to go this route to provide the memorial resolution to send the considered opinion of our diocese. That's the process that we hold to within our church, and following the decision of General Synod, whichever way that goes, that will determine what we do when we get to our diocesan synod in 2020. And it will depend. And then we get into a lot of hypotheticals, and I never like to get into hypotheticals. But just gives you a little bit of a sense of the process. But at the end, if you have any further questions around that, I'd be happy to answer those. I've hacked way into your time, Bill. I'm going to sit down now, but I'm going to offer a prayer. This is the prayer that was included in this Holy Estate for our church as we continue to work through this material, and I'll offer it now and hand it over to my colleague, Bill. Let us pray. The Lord be with you. Almighty and ever-living God, source of all wisdom and understanding, be present with those who take counsel for the renewal and mission of your church. Teach us in all things to seek first your honor and glory. Guide us to perceive what is right, and grant us both the courage to pursue it and the grace to accomplish it.